Silence is often mistaken for peace. For over 60 years, Burkina Faso rested in that silence. Unchallenged, unspoken, unknown. It stood apart from its neighbors, who wrote bans against same-sex love into colonial-era laws. But Burkina Faso never did. It neither celebrated nor condemned. It simply remained still. Until now. In September 2025, the silence was shattered. The parliament in Ouagadougou stood unanimous. Hands raised high, voices united, and passed a law criminalizing homosexuality for the first time in the nation's history. A country once neutral now stands at the center of Africa's most divisive debate: morality, sovereignty, and the right to choose. This is not just about law. It is about power. It is about a continent tired of being told what values to hold, what freedoms to adopt, and whose approval to seek. Stay with us. What you're about to hear isn't just a law. It's a battle for Africa's soul. Subscribe and take your seat in the conversation for a future that is ours to define. For much of its post-independence history, Burkina Faso walked a quiet path. While its neighbors, Nigeria, Mali, Uganda, codified colonial doctrines into modern law, criminalizing same-sex relations with fervor, Burkina Faso remained silent. It was not a sanctuary. It was not a rebellion. It was a void. A deliberate, complex quiet that stood still while the world argued loudly. That legal neutrality began in 1960, the year of independence. Unlike former British colonies that inherited Victorian codes, Burkina Faso, formerly under French rule, emerged without anti-LGBT laws. Its penal code simply made no mention. For decades, that omission was both shield and sword. It offered no protection but issued no persecution. Homosexuality existed in the shadows, whispered in alleyways, hidden from pulpits, and ignored by the law. In practice, society remained deeply conservative. Over 90% of citizens identify with either Islam or Christianity, and cultural norms, whether religious or traditional, viewed same-sex intimacy with discomfort, if not outright rejection. Yet the state did not police bedrooms. It governed the streets, not the soul. But that fragile equilibrium was never built to last. The 2020s brought a reckoning. Across the continent, tides were shifting. Uganda intensified its crackdowns, even legislating the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality. Nigeria toughened its stance. Ghana debated sweeping new restrictions. And all the while, Burkina Faso remained legally silent. To many within, this silence was viewed as negligence, worse, a betrayal of national values. To others, it was a rare space of restraint. But silence in times of noise becomes unbearable. Enter Captain Ibrahim Traoré. In 2022, the young officer seized power in a coup, pledging to end jihadist violence, foreign meddling, and political rot. He spoke of sovereignty not as a slogan but as salvation. By 2024, under his transitional government, a proposal surfaced: amend the penal code to explicitly criminalize homosexuality. The language was direct. Same-sex acts would carry prison terms of up to 5 years. Foreigners found guilty would face deportation. The time of ambiguity was ending. Debate followed, but not the kind one might expect. There were no fiery televised clashes, no prolonged parliamentary deadlock. Instead, the measure sailed through. On a crisp September day in 2025, the National Assembly convened. Cameras captured the vote. One by one, hands rose. No abstentions. No objections. A unanimous decision. And just like that, the silence ended. The news spread within hours. In the capital, crowds gathered not to protest, but to celebrate. In mosques, churches, and town squares, the law was declared a return to moral order. Across social media, slogans bloomed like wildfire. Our law, our land. We are not Paris. We are not Washington. Murals appeared overnight, showing Captain Traoré silhouetted against the national flag, flanked by the words, "Sovereignty begins at home." For many Burkinabe, this wasn't simply about sexuality. It was about voice. It was about a government that, for the first time in decades, they felt was speaking their language. Not the language of donors or diplomats, but of family, ancestry, and faith. The law became symbolic, a line drawn in the sand. But symbolism, however powerful, always carries consequence. But this law was only the matchstick. What followed set the entire political theater ablaze. The moment the vote passed, the ground shifted, not only in Ouagadougou, but across continents. What had been a local debate turned overnight into a global flashpoint. In Burkina Faso, the mood was electric. Celebration erupted in markets, mosques, churches. Elders gathered in prayer circles. Youths marched with flags, chanting, "Our law, our land, our voice." It was not just the passage of a bill, it was the affirmation of a worldview. In the eyes of many, the state had finally stepped forward to protect what they considered sacred: culture, family, tradition. Captain Ibrahim Traoré emerged days later, not with apology but resolve. Dressed in fatigues, standing before a sea of supporters, he declared, "We will not be dictated to by outsiders. Our laws are our own." The crowd erupted. The line was simple, but it cut deep. In a nation long burdened by foreign prescriptions, from structural adjustment plans to military partnerships, the assertion of moral self-determination struck a powerful chord. But abroad, the reaction was swift and sharp. The United Nations issued a statement expressing grave concern. The European Union threatened a review of development aid. U.S. officials hinted at sanctions, describing the law as a step backwards in democratic values. Global human rights organizations published urgent reports, naming Burkina Faso the latest battleground in Africa's regression on human rights. Western media framed the story in stark terms: authoritarianism, bigotry, isolationism. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso joins anti-LGBT wave, another democracy in retreat." For many in the West, it was a moment of dismay. But in Africa, the resonance was far more complex. Governments in Mali and Niger offered vocal support. In Uganda, where similar legislation had drawn international backlash, officials praised Burkina Faso for its courage. Ghanaian lawmakers pointed to the vote as proof that Africa's cultural revival was real and growing. From Accra to Bamako, the message echoed, "This is not isolation. This is self-definition." The diaspora, too, joined the fray. African voices in London, Paris, New York clashed online, some condemning the law as repressive, others defending it as a stand for sovereignty. Hashtags collided: #stand with Burkina versus #rights are universal. Beneath the noise, a deeper question emerged. Was this law truly about morality or about resistance? Critics of Traoré argued he was consolidating power by turning cultural grievance into political capital. They pointed to his tightening grip on the media, the repression of dissent, the expulsion of French forces, and rising partnerships with Russia and China. They called it a dangerous populism, cloaked in patriotism. But supporters saw something else: a young leader finally reflecting the voice of his people, a country long ignored now standing on its feet. In a region plagued by coups, corruption, and dependency, Traoré's clarity, even if controversial, offered direction. Still, tension grew. Western embassies re-evaluated their presence. Financial institutions reviewed aid packages. Diplomats began speaking in coded warnings. And at home, the law took root. Arrests were not yet common, but the tone of public life changed. Teachers, clerics, and radio hosts invoked the new law as evidence of moral triumph. In private, queer Burkinabe braced for a storm. Some fled, others hid. Fear spread silently, just as silence had once protected them. This was the paradox. A law celebrated as liberation by many had become a sentence of fear for others. But when defiance meets dependency, who wins? The people or the pressure? The vote was unanimous. The slogans were triumphant. But soon the weight of governance returned. In the immediate aftermath of the law's passage, life in Burkina Faso did not transform overnight, but its undercurrents began to shift. In schools, educators received new moral guidance. Local radio stations altered their tone. In city centers, posters appeared warning against foreign immorality. It was clear the law was not just on paper, it had entered the public psyche. For the average Burkinabe, this change brought mixed outcomes. In religious circles and conservative communities, it was welcomed. Sermons framed the moment as a divine correction. Parents spoke with renewed clarity about African values. In a society where public morality is closely tied to communal honor, the law became a reaffirmation of national identity. But in private, fear brewed. For LGBTQ+ citizens, life narrowed. Community gatherings went silent. Support networks went underground. Some sought visas to escape, others deleted years of online presence overnight. A sense of hunted stillness settled across those who now found themselves outside the protection of the law. And yet, for all the noise, the more visible shockwaves came not from culture, but from the economy. Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest nations, relies heavily on international aid. Nearly half its national budget is donor-dependent. Within weeks of the vote, development agencies issued reviews. Some paused disbursements. Medical NGOs signaled concern. Investment discussions with European partners were delayed. A quiet chill moved through financial corridors. The cost of sovereignty was beginning to show. In the countryside, where most of the population lives, inflation bit harder. Fuel prices crept upward. Basic commodities from rice to soap became harder to afford. For rural women who relied on foreign-funded clinics, uncertainty grew. Would the services continue? Would medicines arrive? Politically, however, Traoré's position strengthened. His firm stance, his unapologetic speeches, his rejection of Western outrage, all won him admiration, especially among the young. For decades, Burkina Faso's leadership had been seen as docile, dependent, distant. Traoré was none of those things. Murals of his image multiplied. Online, videos of his declarations, "We do not beg for approval," racked up millions of views. Among veterans of Pan-African thought, he was compared to Sankara. Among the youth, he was trending. But even supporters felt the strain. Civil servants quietly questioned the timing. Was this the right battle, given the insurgencies still ravaging the north? Entrepreneurs worried about access to international markets. Parents wondered whether future visas for their children would be blocked. Beneath the surface celebration, a reckoning brewed. Because sovereignty, when not paired with capacity, becomes a burden. And in Burkina Faso, that balance remains delicate. Still, the broader shift was undeniable. The nation had spoken, loudly, clearly, proudly, but also precariously. The question that lingers is this: can a people reclaim their voice without losing their footing? And for our audience, elders of the diaspora, keepers of legacy, voices of memory, I pose this directly. If you believe that dignity means choosing your path even when the cost is high, type "we stand" in the comments below. Because silence has never served us well. Still, the global chessboard was shifting, and Africa was no longer a silent square. The law echoed far beyond Ouagadougou. In Brussels, Washington, and Geneva, the response was immediate and severe. The United Nations Human Rights Office called it a dangerous regression. The European Union placed Burkina Faso under review for ongoing development assistance. From Washington, a spokesperson for the State Department warned of potential implications for bilateral relations and aid programs. Across international NGOs, alarm bells rang. Some began contingency planning. Others mobilized advocacy campaigns, spotlighting Burkina Faso as the newest front in the global contest between liberal norms and conservative resurgence. But here's the tension. While the West cried violation, many in Africa saw vindication. In Bamako, Niamey, and Kampala, the reaction was supportive. Leaders in Mali and Niger, Traoré's closest allies, publicly praised Burkina Faso for taking a stand. Uganda, already sanctioned for similar legislation, issued statements of solidarity. Ghanaian MPs cited the vote as proof of an emerging cultural consensus across the continent. And then came the silence from Moscow and Beijing. Not condemnation, but quiet approval through action. Russia deepened military cooperation with Burkina Faso. China initiated exploratory talks around infrastructure development, telecommunications, and mining. These overtures were not new, but now they gained weight. For Traoré's government, they offered something the West no longer did: partnership without conditionality. This is the heart of the geopolitical shift. For decades, Western aid came with caveats: economic liberalization, human rights benchmarks, civil society engagement. In return, African governments received resources, but also scrutiny. Increasingly, that exchange feels untenable. Many now see it not as assistance, but interference. And so, Burkina Faso's law became a symbol, not only of cultural conservatism, but of resistance to external influence. A declaration that decisions once made in Paris or New York would now be authored in Ouagadougou. Yet this assertion carries cost. If aid is withdrawn, if sanctions tighten, if international forums isolate the country, can new alliances fill the gap? Can China or Russia replace decades of Western systems overnight? Can ideological alignment outweigh economic necessity? The United States finds itself in a dilemma. To uphold its human rights agenda, it must speak out. But in doing so, it risks pushing fragile states into the arms of strategic rivals. The paradox is clear. Defending values may accelerate the very geopolitical retreat America fears. And so a question looms, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the world. Who truly owns Africa's future, its people, or its partners? As the world draws lines in the sand, Burkina Faso is building its own path, brick by sovereign brick. The law has passed. The world has spoken. The lines have been drawn. And now the real question begins: what lies ahead? Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads, not just of policy, but of identity. It can press forward into deeper independence, forging alliances outside the Western sphere. Or it can attempt a delicate balancing act, maintaining cultural autonomy while salvaging ties to the global system. Both paths carry weight. Both demand sacrifice. One path is paved with pride but strewn with peril. Continued defiance may deepen diplomatic isolation. Sanctions could bite harder. Investment may dry up. And without sustainable alternatives, the state risks overpromising and underdelivering, especially to those who believe sovereignty would bring swift transformation. But the other path, returning to accommodation, softening the tone, may fracture internal unity. It may be read as surrender, a step back from a moment many now see as historic. For Chow Phi as a whole, this dilemma is larger than any one law. Across the continent, a new generation is emerging, proud, assertive, weary of being lectured, and hungry for dignity on its own terms. The debate over African anti-LGBT legislation has exposed something deeper, a yearning not just to legislate but to define, to say this is who we are. Not because Paris agrees, not because Washington approves, but because we chose it. This is the challenge of our time. Can Africa build a future that is free and modern yet faithful to its soul? Can sovereignty be reimagined, not as withdrawal from the world, but as negotiation on equal ground? And perhaps most importantly, for those who remember the colonial years, who lived through coups and currency crises, and who raised generations in resilience, how do we honor that legacy? By bending once more, or by standing, no matter the storm? And as that question hangs in the air, one image remains: raised hands, firm voices, and a law that won't be undone. Every generation is handed a moment, an hour where silence can no longer stand. For Burkina Faso, that moment came in a vote, in raised hands, in voices that dared say, our law is not borrowed, it is born of us. The passage of the Burkina Faso sovereignty law was more than legislation, it was a declaration, a signal that in this century African nations would not be bound by the comfort of compliance. They would risk pain to regain pride. They would speak their truth, even if the world turned its back. For many in the West, this is a moment of concern. They see the rise of African anti-LGBT legislation as a retreat from global norms. But within Africa, the story is far more layered. It is about autonomy, about the burden of being told who to be for too long. The Burkina Faso sovereignty law now stands as a symbol, controversial, defiant, unforgettable. Whether one agrees or disagrees, its message is clear. Independence is not inherited, it is asserted. To the elders watching this, those who remember when flags changed but chains stayed, this story is familiar. The fight for dignity was never just on battlefields. It was also in courtrooms, classrooms, in the very words we are allowed to speak. And to the younger ones, watching history as it writes itself, know this: sovereignty is not without sacrifice. But dignity once claimed can remake a people. If this story stirs your sense of justice or your hope for Africa's future, don't scroll. Like, share, and stand with us. Subscribe, because the battle for dignity begins with being heard. Africa Rise. Vertical bar, we choose who we are. Vertical bar, our hands, our law, our legacy.